Just as the man was about to check in, every flight on the airport departure board was suddenly canceled. Seconds later, hundreds of phones started ringing across the terminal. The government had declared a nationwide state of emergency and ordered everyone to stop traveling immediately. But the announcement gave no explanation, and no one knew what was happening in the city. As panic spread through the terminal, Manel received a call from his sister. She worked for the military, and within seconds, she revealed the truth the authorities were trying to hide. An unknown virus had already entered the city. Within minutes of becoming infected, people would lose control and violently attack anyone nearby. She told Manel not to trust any sudden official orders, to go straight home and lock every door. Ever since his wife died, Manel had never truly recovered from the loss. Now, the only companion he had left was his cat, Lúculo. The airport was already shut down, and every road out of the city was packed with traffic. Manel realized that staying trapped in traffic would leave him with nowhere to run. He immediately abandoned his car and carried Lúculo back to his home outside the city. By the time he reached the neighborhood, it was already dark. Several military vehicles were parked outside a neighbor's home, and armed soldiers had sealed off the entire building. They claimed that someone inside had come down with a severe case of rabies, but Manel knew the virus had already reached his neighborhood. The next day, his sister contacted him again. The virus was mutating rapidly, and both its infection rate and aggression were far worse than first believed. The authorities were preparing to set up mass quarantine centers, but she repeatedly warned Manel not to leave his house, no matter who came to evacuate him. Soon, television broadcasts ordered everyone to remain indoors. The news still refused to reveal the truth about the infected, but Manel knew he could not afford to wait. He rushed to a nearby supermarket for food and medicine, only to find the shelves completely empty. Clearly, other people had already started preparing for the worst. Manel headed to a gas station convenience store instead, but there was almost nothing left there either. Even worse, the virus had beaten him there. A police officer had been bitten by one of the infected. Knowing he could soon lose control, the officer locked himself inside the store to keep from hurting anyone else. Just then, another infected person suddenly charged at Manel. Manel grabbed a mop and tried to push the attacker back. But the infected were far faster and stronger than normal people. Just before Manel was knocked to the ground, the wounded officer used his final moments of control to shoot the infected attacker. Only then did Manel fully understand the danger. This virus could destroy an entire city in a matter of minutes. That night, the government finally admitted that the outbreak was out of control. The military would evacuate the remaining residents the next day and take them to temporary quarantine centers. Following his sister's warning, Manel reinforced the doors and windows, turned off every light, and hid deep inside the house.
Prepárense para ser evacuados al punto seguro más cercano. Allí permanecerán hasta que descienda la alerta sanitaria. Negarse a la evacuación se considerará una violación de la Ley de Seguridad Nacional.
The next day, the residents of the neighborhood began boarding military vehicles. Before long, Manel's house was the only one showing no activity. When the soldiers realized someone was still inside, they began pounding on the door. After receiving no response, several of them tried to force their way in. Fortunately, Manel had already barricaded the door, and even Lúculo seemed to sense the danger and went completely silent. After several failed attempts to break in, the soldiers finally gave up and left. From that moment on, Manel was completely cut off from the outside world. For the first few days, he survived on the food he had stored. His solar panels provided just enough power to charge his phone, but there was still no signal. He sent his sister a message every day to let her know he was alive, but none of them went through. 2 weeks later, his food was completely gone, and staying inside would only mean slowly starving to death. Manel put on a diving suit for protection and began searching his neighbors' homes for supplies. Most residents had left in a hurry, leaving behind little more than overturned furniture and empty rooms. It was not until he entered another house that he discovered someone else had stayed behind. She was an elderly woman with limited mobility. She had refused to leave with the military because she knew her body would never survive the chaos of a quarantine center. The old woman knew every family in the neighborhood. With her guidance, Manel found a motorcycle. He also recovered a few cans of food and some bread from several hidden places. But it was nowhere near enough to keep 2 people alive for long.
Si esto es todo lo que podemos conseguir, deberías irte con los militares. Aquí vamos a acabar comiéndonos el uno al otro.
The old woman sounded like she was joking, but her words described the reality they were facing. Manel suddenly remembered that the first infected house in the neighborhood had remained sealed off. The owners had never been evacuated, which meant there might still be food inside. He risked entering the house, only to find the refrigerator and cabinets completely empty. Just as Manel was about to leave, someone suddenly appeared behind him. The stranger was another survivor who had remained in the area. The unexpected encounter also led Manel to a large supply of food hidden behind a cabinet. That night, a message from other survivors came over the radio. A temporary camp had been established outside the city and was accepting anyone still trapped nearby. His sister's final instruction had been to remain at home, but the house was no longer safe, and the remaining food would not last much longer. He finally decided to take the old woman to the camp the following morning. But when he came to get her, all he found was a note waiting on the table. The old woman knew her body could not survive the journey. She also refused to let Manel lose his chance of survival by taking care of her. So she took an overdose and ended her own life. The note contained one simple wish, telling him to take Lúculo and keep living. Manel could not stay for long. So, after a brief moment of silence, he forced himself to leave. Before leaving the neighborhood, Manel was attacked by an infected woman. It took everything he had to kill her. Afterward, he found her identification and placed it on her chest. In a world where anyone could become a monster, he still wanted this stranger to keep her name, even in death. Manel then placed Lúculo on the motorcycle and headed toward the survivors' camp. But the sound of the motorcycle quickly attracted a large group of infected. When he reached the camp, he discovered that the supposed safe haven had already fallen. The area behind the fence was packed with infected people. Instead of saving survivors, the camp had become a death trap that drew them straight into danger. Manel immediately turned around and headed for the marina. Along the way, a pile of bodies caused him to lose control, and the motorcycle would not start again. The infected were already closing in. He picked up Lúculo and continued on foot, because he still had a small boat waiting at the marina. It was his final chance to reach the island where his sister was staying, but when he reached the shore, his boat was gone. Cold water stretched out in front of him. While the infected closed in from behind, Manel had no choice but to jump into an abandoned lifeboat and start the engine, barely escaping in time. But shortly after leaving the shore, a body underwater became tangled in the propeller. The lifeboat lost power, leaving Manel stranded at sea. Sometime later, a large fishing boat approached him. The crew pulled Manel and Lúculo aboard. Manel appeared to have escaped death, but he soon realized that this boat was no refuge for survivors. The captain and his crew had been violent criminals long before the outbreak. Now that society had collapsed, they saw the empty cities as warehouses waiting to be looted. They had not rescued Manel out of kindness. They needed someone who knew the area and could lead them to banks, jewelry, and supplies. When the captain asked what Manel did for a living, Manel honestly answered that he was a lawyer. But Sam, who was translating for them, deliberately told the captain that Manel was an engineer. To these men, an engineer was far more useful than a lawyer. In other words, Sam's lie had saved Manel's life. That night, they heard survivors calling for help from outside the boat. Several people were brought aboard, but they were never seen again. The next morning, Sam had fresh injuries on his face. When Manel questioned him, Sam told him to keep his eyes down, stop asking questions, and focus on staying alive. But Manel had already figured out what had happened to the missing survivors. He refused to give the captain the exact location of the bank. He then quietly told Sam that there might still be a helicopter at the hospital. Sam had once been a pilot. If they could escape the boat, they might be able to fly to the island where Manel's sister was staying. Sam did not agree to the plan, but he did not betray Manel either. Late that night, Manel put on his protective gear and prepared to escape. But when he thought about the survivors brought aboard the night before, he turned around and headed into the lower deck. Two survivors who had lost their families were being held there. They mistook Manel for one of the killers, and the noise they made in panic alerted the guards. One of them was shot dead immediately, while Manel became trapped inside the narrow compartment. At the critical moment, Sam finally chose to fight back. He shot the approaching crewman and led Manel and the other survivor toward a lifeboat. During the gunfight, Sam was shot in the shoulder, and the other survivor was killed before they could escape. In the end, only 2 wounded men and 1 cat made it off the boat. They returned to the fallen city, planning to remove the bullet at the hospital before searching for the helicopter. But the helicopter outside the hospital was already gone. Manel hid Lúculo inside an operating room and went out alone to search for medicine and surgical equipment. Just then, he heard the voices of a woman and several children coming through the ventilation system. Several survivors were still hiding somewhere inside the hospital. But just as Manel made contact with them, the sound of his voice attracted the infected. He ran back to the operating room, only to discover that both Sam and Lúculo were gone. Just as the infected were about to reach him, a hidden door in the wall suddenly opened. A nurse named Berta pulled him into the hidden passage. The head nurse and 3 children were hiding inside as well. They had already rescued Sam and removed the bullet from his shoulder. When Berta learned they were looking for a helicopter, she took them to a place overlooking the rear courtyard. Sure enough, a helicopter was sitting outside, but the landing area was surrounded by infected, making it almost impossible to reach. As they searched for a way through, Manel's phone suddenly regained a signal. All the messages his sister had sent began arriving one after another. Before he could finish reading them, the criminals from the boat arrived at the hospital. They had secretly planted a tracking device on Sam and were now searching the building with weapons. Unlike the infected, these men could think, plan, and hunt them down. Their only option was to take a dangerous route through the underground boiler room and reach the courtyard. An explosion had filled the area with smoke and dust, forcing everyone to cover their mouths and noses as they moved through. But an infected person hiding behind a door suddenly attacked, and the head nurse was bitten while protecting the children. Knowing there was no way to save her, she stayed behind alone to block the passage. When the others reached the courtyard entrance, a large group of infected was still wandering outside. Berta had found a route that might allow them to slip past unnoticed, but one of the girls suddenly saw her infected mother among the crowd. The moment she cried out for her mother, every infected person nearby turned toward them. At that moment, heavy gunfire suddenly erupted in the distance. The criminals chasing them cleared the infected from the entrance, but they also cut off the survivors' escape route. Fortunately, they had not spotted Manel yet. After the gunman moved away, Manel finally stepped out of hiding. He gathered several abandoned metal frames and turned them into a movable circular barricade. Everyone stayed inside it as they slowly pushed their way toward the helicopter. The infected quickly surrounded the barricade, nearly trapping the entire group in the middle of the crowd. Sam had no choice but to break away first and run toward the cockpit to start the helicopter. Manel stayed behind to secure the hospital doors and buy Sam as much time as possible. But just as the helicopter started, the armed criminals charged into the courtyard. If Sam took off immediately, Manel would be left behind. But if he shut down the helicopter and surrendered, everyone would die. Manel and Sam exchanged a look, and both immediately understood what had to be done. Manel suddenly released the doors he had just secured, allowing the infected outside to flood into the courtyard. The criminals barely had time to react before the infected overwhelmed them. Sam lifted the helicopter into the air, while Berta threw a rescue ladder from the open door. Manel grabbed the ladder just before the infected reached him and finally escaped the city that had completely collapsed. He believed the worst part of the journey was finally over, but at that moment, his sister called.
Manel, ¿dónde estás?
Voy de camino.
Manel, no vengas a Canarias. Da la vuelta, no vengas. Por favor, no vengas a Canarias.
Before Manel could ask what was happening, the connection was lost again. The helicopter was already heading toward the island where his sister was supposed to be safe. But no one knew what had happened there. Manel survived one disaster after another, not because he was stronger than everyone else. He survived because even when fear threatened to strip away everyone's humanity, he refused to abandon his compassion. Even when he had nowhere left to run, he was still willing to give someone else a chance to survive. The virus could turn a person into a monster within minutes. But what truly defined someone was never whether they had been infected. It was how they chose to treat the people around them after rules, laws, and hope had all disappeared. But his sister's final warning revealed that Manel may have escaped only the first city to fall. What waited ahead might not be a family reunion, but another apocalypse that was only just beginning.